Korea's 20th presidential election is slated for tomorrow. That would be March 9th, and it is the first to take place amid a pandemic. Accordingly, preparations at polling stations include a host of health precautions as well. Do take a look.
South Korea's 20th presidential election will be held on March 9th. It is the first of its kind taking place amid a pandemic. Therefore, the process of preparing for the election was different than before. For instance, candidate speeches were held without an audience, and COVID-19 prevention measures were a major topic of presidential debates.
Just as the election campaign has changed due to COVID-19, the scenery of South Korea's presidential election polling stations will look different than before. So let's take a look at what's changing.
This presidential election is the first one in which 18-year-olds have the right to vote. In the previous presidential election, only citizens aged 19 and above could vote. Not only that, COVID-19 patients and people in self-quarantine would also be able to vote in person.
지난 2월 16일 코로나19 확진 격리자들의 참정권 보장을 위해 공직선거법이 개정되었습니다. 3월 9일 선거일 오후 6시부터 오후 7시 30분까지 관할 투표소를 방문하시면 코로나 확진 격리 유권자분들도 투표하실 수 있습니다.
On election day, general voters can visit designated polling stations between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. as before. Voting is also possible for those who tested positive for COVID-19 and are self-isolation, but from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And they will be allowed to leave their homes or facilities to get to the polling stations and must also immediately return home after casting their ballots and cannot stop by other places. If you get infected or are under self-quarantine, you should not use public transportation to get to polling stations. You have to wear a mask all the time and minimize contact with others by walking to the polling stations or using private vehicles or quarantine taxis. When you arrive at the polling station, you must present a text message that confirms you are a COVID-19 patient. After that, you're able to cast your ballot.
선거관리위원회는 투표소 소독, 환기 등 방역에 최선을 다하고 있습니다. 담당 사무원 및 참관인은 전신보호복, 안면보호구 등 개인보호구를 착용합니다.
Based on the experience of the 2020 general election, which was the first major election to take place amid the pandemic, as well as the by-election in April last year, the National Election Commission plans to focus on creating safe and clean environment for voters. In fact, both of the earlier elections concluded without a single infection at the polling stations.
In the 21st general election in 2020 and the by-election last year, confirmed patients could only vote by mail or vote during the early voting period. However, this is the first time that people who tested positive can exercise their right to vote in person and on the same day as non-infected voters. As COVID-19 patients make their way to the polling station on their own, it is almost impossible to control each and every case. In addition to this, the possibility of infected voters crossing paths with non-infected voters cannot be ruled out.
1차적으로 제일 중요한 거는 그 확진자들이나 격리자들과 그 일반 투표자들이 이 동선 과정에서 최소한 1m 이상 이내에 붙는 그런 그 과정들은 없어야 된다고 생각하거든요. 또한 이제 접촉 감염은 이제 공용으로 만지는 그런 상황들, 그냥 공용 물품이나 그런 시설들을 만지는 상황에서 생기는데 가장 유의해야 될 부분들은 사실 화장실이라고 생각을 합니다. 그래서 가능하다 그러면 확진자와 이제 그런 확진자와 일반 투표자들은 그 최대한도로 동선을 떨어뜨리고.
The number of daily confirmed cases increased faster than health authorities earlier expected, and the number of self-quarantined patients exceeded 1 million this past weekend. That's more than 2% of almost 44.2 million eligible voters. Meanwhile, the National Election Commission apologized for controversy over the management of temporary polling booths for COVID-19 patients in the early voting period last weekend. Therefore, on the actual election day, people who tested positive and are in self-quarantine will vote in the same way as non-infected voters at the same voting booths, once all general voters have left the election venue.
The upcoming presidential election will be held under the challenging circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic. So please make sure to follow strict COVID-19 prevention measures when visiting polling stations to cast your ballot. This has been Jessica Lee.